请大家稍等一下，我们马上进行今天早上的第2场演讲。好，那我们准备欢迎 Eric， 另外一个 Eric。好，那我们接下来这场演讲呢，是由这个 Google 的这个工程师Eric Bidelman 来为我们讲这个关于一样是 HTML5 的一些开发上面的议题。好，那这位 Eric 先生呢，他之前在 Google 都是就是做一些产品，比方说像 Google Docs、Site， 然后 Health and 一些Data API 等等。那他目前在这个Google 的 Chrome 的 team 里头，然后并且就是向外这个传播这个 HTML5 的福音。好，所以我们可以称为他是一个福音战士。不对，是传教士。好，这个 HTML5 的传教士。好，那我想我们时间也不多了。好，那我们现在一样以热烈的掌声欢迎这个Eric Bidelman。
属性做转变，所以今天我选择了 background color with 还有 height 做转变。然后转变的过程是，第一个对象我要转变4秒，第二个对象我要转变8秒，第三个对象要转变5秒。然后我也同时设定了最后一个对象要2秒之后才开始转变，所以最后一个对象的 height 是在2秒之后转变5秒，所以它那个转变是逐渐的转变，而不是你按它就直接变到另外一个对象。OK， 我这里可以给大家做一个很简单的。是这个吗？比方说这个它的转变是所有对象，所以只要我把我的鼠标 hover 到对象，它就会从75的 pixel 的高度转变到150，而且它转变的速度只有0.3秒。
Give me 1 second.
然后同一个时候，大家也可以 set 这个 is in out 这个 function。就是怎么说呢？就你要那个转变是开始快，然后之后慢，或者是不同的选择，就它有几个选择让大家去选。所以这个很简单 ，CSS 就3行也搞定了。
That looks good. Okay, so for any of those that didn't catch that, my name is Eric Bidelman, and I work on our Google Chrome developer relations team. I specifically work on HTML5 stuff. I'm one of the contributors to the HTML5 Rocks playground and site that you saw. And I'll show you some cool stuff. We actually just had a major release, I believe yesterday or today. I don't know which time zone my body's in anymore. But today we're going to talk a little bit about what it takes to build an HTML5 application, sort of some performance techniques that you can take advantage of in sort of making the next generation of application on the web. So we'll talk about performance. I'll sort of discuss, there's some really sexy APIs in HTML5, right? There's Canvas, there's video, there's WebGL, there's all these graphical APIs that people usually demo and show. I'm going to sort of also talk about a few of those, but we'll also cover some of the lesser known APIs that you can use and some of the things that are sort of less sexy, but also very, very useful in writing web applications. We'll talk about some of the markup. HTML5 has a ton of new markup for describing semantics and the presentation and layout of a page, but there's also some markup that really relates to the way web applications are built. I'll talk a little bit about web workers and WebSockets. Michael sort of alluded to that. I might skip over some of that depending on how much time we have. Compatibility is still a huge issue, right? Because HTML5, it's getting there, but it's not quite there yet. And then some great tools and resources. So, quick performance wins. So the first tip I have for you today is do not underestimate CSS, right? CSS3 has come a long, long way. And as a web developer, right, we sort of get in this rut of developing using a library like jQuery, which is a great library, I use it all the time, for animations and rounded corners and all this stuff, box shadows and CSS masks and alpha channels. But all that is now available in CSS. And so you can offload all of that onto the rendering process of the browser. So A quick example of just an animation, right? Just by applying a class and the transition property of WebKit, Moz, and O for Opera, you can move the box, right, or whatever have you. Anything on the DOM is manipulable with CSS. So it's super, super powerful. Another tip, right? So with CSS3 3D transforms, instead of moving that using the left property, maybe we use translate 3D and move it using the X coordinate there. So just another thing to keep in mind. And that will give us hardware acceleration, which is great because that's super, super fast and it's going to look beautiful on the web. A couple other things that people don't typically remember are things like web fonts. So browsers have tried to do web fonts for a long time now, and fortunately, they're finally becoming a reality in the web, and all the browsers are supporting them. Pseudo selectors too. We'll discuss a little bit about HTML5 forms. If you've ever built a form on the web and doing validation and all that with JavaScript, it's just a huge pain. Next tip, native is always better. So again, the idea here is that we've been doing things like JSON parsing and trimming, padding off a string using libraries like jQuery and Prototype and Dojo and all these. But this stuff is now native as part of JavaScript 1.6 plus. So you can do native parsing in JSON or in Stringify and serialize data. There's selectors. So, again, it's popularized by a library like jQuery, but this stuff is available in the browser. It's going to be more performant. Paint, don't download. This is just sort of another tip, right? We have different APIs like Canvas and video and some WebGL and SVG. There's actually methods for embedding base64 encoded values, right? So instead of sending an image source to an actual image and making an HTTP request, you can just set a base64 encoded version of that. Browser doesn't cache it, but it's still very performant because you're saving your some bandwidth there. Some more stuff in JavaScript 1.6. So the array class has been sort of updated. We do this stuff in jQuery, iteration over for each, filtering, mapping certain values onto other values. Just some things to think about, right? There's a lot of sort of, when we cover HTML5, we say there's the spec, but there's also sort of HTML5++, which includes CSS and this sort of stuff. So HTML5 markup, more than just semantics. My clicker doesn't work. Yeah. So there's a couple of things you should be aware of in some of the semantics in HTML5. Two I just sort of realized myself are the rel. There's a couple new rel attributes. So the first is pingback, and the second is prefetch. Pingback, so say you have a blog, right? And it's a really popular blog, maybe the Chromium blog, maybe Google Code blog or something like that. And at the end of the blog, it lists all the other blogs that are linked into that blog. So one way that can be accomplished is using this anchor tag with the rel pingback, notifying that parent blog that that link is happening. Another example is prefetch. So a good use case here is, say, a web search, right? You know the user is probably going to click on the top link. It's most relevant. Might as well prefetch that page. Give the browser a hint in order to download that page and give them a little bit more speedy performance. Same thing with pagination using the prefetch on the href. I guess that should be a rel. It's a mistake in my slides. I apologize. HTML5 forms. How many have ever built a form in HTML5 and used jQuery or some JS validation? And it's just been ugly, ugly, ugly. I just want to show you. We covered some of this in the keynote, but I want to show you some other stuff in HTML5 forms. This is something I put together on the plane, just to show you how easy it is. We have a bunch of new attributes in the input tag. So the first thing, and sorry it's sort of off screen, and they just got a full screen. The first thing is new CSS selectors, right? So we have invalid properties. We have disabled and input. You can actually, based on the attribute, the required attribute, change the background color to light yellow, saying that this input value is required. So the key takeaway from this page, and I'll show you the rest of these, but there's no JavaScript on this page. So I can come in here, and this is being styled because it's a required field. And so once I start typing and the user's input some value, it's going to change the CSS selection, and therefore I don't have the red border anymore in my invalid state right here. Right, there's a search input, which is great, very similar to Apple's search. There's a range. How many times have we built these, using divs and whatnot on the web, using a library? This is all built in the browser. It's going to be native. It's going to be performant. Autofocus. When this page first loaded, the email box there has been autofocused. Like 90% of the JavaScript on the web today probably autofocuses as an input someplace on a page. Don't have to do that using JavaScript anymore. Again, color, there's date pickers, regex patterns for things like telephone numbers. That's pretty cool, right? Again, no JavaScript. Two or three that I actually forgot about myself are the two at the bottom here, the meter tag and the progress tag. So again, this is stuff we've implemented in libraries, UI libraries, but this is something that is now available in browsers. And WebKit in particular is getting pretty good at supporting a lot of these. So for instance, the meter here is, there's a max value of 100 and there's a value of 30, so you can see it's set appropriately. If the browser doesn't support this particular input type, this meter tag, it's just going to have literally 30% showing. So you still can have a fallback case for compatibility. Talk a little bit about web storage. So web storage is great because we can finally take our applications offline, right? We're sort of in this mobile society now. We have mobile phones, we have mobile devices, we have laptops. You're going to want to be able to access your data anywhere, anytime. And so web storage is really going to help with that. But it's really more than just taking your apps offline. It's also going to be for performance. So say you have a Twitter application or something. Might as well cache the first 25 tweets every time the user loads your app in the WebSQL database or something similar, an IndexedDB, instead of querying a server each time. So there's three key options right now, and these were sort of discussed before, but local storage is the first. It's really simple. There's just key value pairs. So the first example, I set my date of birth just as a string and store it in the local cache of the local storage of the browser. And then every time my app loads, if I need to recall that information, I can just reference that as a JavaScript object. Another example is using the native JSON stringify and parsing algorithm that I talked about before. So you can actually serialize JSON objects instead of just a string. You can input JSON and then get it back out, so more complex objects to store. Session storage, same idea as local storage. But the data is sensitive, and it's not persistent. So at the end of the browsing session, it's completely flushed. That would be great for something like a banking session. Last is WebSQL database, and we'll take a look at that, what that looks like. As Mike said, this is something that's been implemented in Chrome, but the other browsers are fairly unlikely to implement it. So the second option is IndexedDB, which is sort of a hybrid of local storage and WebSQL. So the first thing you do, right, it's just SQL. If you're familiar with WebSQL or SQL in general, this will be pretty familiar to you. So the first call to the open, right, you're going to open a database. You're going to give it a size. 5 megabytes is a hard limit in most browsers. Call open, give it a title, give it a description. There's a couple error handlers and success handlers for when things go wrong. Everything is transaction-based. So creating a table is simple as creating a transaction and issuing a SQL statement. So create table. If one doesn't exist, you'll give it a schema, right? A primary key. We'll create a to-do list, give it a full text, and a date time that it's added. And actually creating data is simple as just calling insert with the SQL statement. So pretty cool there. The beauty of the storage APIs is that you can actually see this visually inside of some of the developer tools. So in particular, the WebKit developer tools, Chrome Dev tools, and WebKit developer tools, you can visualize the data, you can issue SQL statements live, and really debug your application on the fly. Next part of sort of offline is the application cache. And this is something that, in particular, the iPhone and Android clients for Gmail use, not just for storing your assets offline, but recalling those and caching them locally. So when the user first loads the app, it feels really, really fast. So app cache is great because you have complete control as a developer. It's HTML, it's CSS, it's images, it's whatever you want to cache locally and fire up the next time the user loads your page. One benefit is that browser caching is sort of unreliable. So as a developer, we really can explicitly say what we want cached. So here's sort of where the magic happens. There's this, first of all, there's the tag, the attribute manifest that you specify in your HTML tag, just saying this is the file that I want to reference my manifest, the list of resources that I want to cache locally. And then the manifest itself is just a simple sort of text file. So there's a cache line, there's a fallback line, and there's a network line. The first under the cache, that's all the explicit files that I want to serve to the user locally when they're offline. So things like HTML documents, CSS, images, these are just relative paths to the resources. Any JavaScript I want available when my app is running offline. fallback. So anytime the user's offline, if they hit the root of my site, this example here is just going to serve a static.html page, just saying, hey, maybe you're offline, please, fix your internet connection if your internet Wi-Fi doesn't work on stage. And then network is sort of everything else. Anything that needs a network connection that isn't listed explicitly in the cache line or the fallback line, things like login scripts or API calls would need a network connection for that. And of course, there's a JavaScript API for it, right? As with everything on the DOM, there's a JavaScript API. And that's inside of window.application cache. And basically, you have error checking and events for everything, right? When the browser's caching the manifest file, when it's updating it, when it's making the progress happen, when it's ready to be served. And you can actually programmatically swap out when the new application cache is ready. One thing I'll quickly mention is a great tip is the second line here. You can see a date timestamp, basically, and a version number. One thing about app cache is if the manifest file doesn't ever change, even if you change, say, a style in your style sheet, the old version is going to be served to your users. So if you change this file, basically a great tip is just to use a timestamp, right? Maybe write a script to parse out all the files in your application, write this file out programmatically, and then the application will serve the new cache version every time, which is great. I'll just quickly mention that app cache is sort of hard to debug. You don't know really when the browser is doing certain things. The developer tools in WebKit have sort of added this console and console statements printing out what's going on behind the scenes. If one file fails, for example, when it's being downloaded, sort of the whole thing, the whole download of the caching of the manifest file fails, which is not too great. But this does give you a little bit more insight to what's going on there. So let's just see a quick demo of app cache running. So this is a really simple clock app, just a timer, right? So there's just one JavaScript file, there's a little bit of CSS, there's some obvious HTML markup. And I'm not going to pull my internet connection out because I'm afraid I'm going to lose it. But if I was on Wi-Fi, I would turn this off and then refresh the page. And what's going on is it's actually caching all these resources locally for us. So to prove to you that this is being cached locally, right? First, I specified the manifest file on the top of my HTML. It's really hard to type with one hand. So this is the cache manifest file for this particular site. It's really simple, right? He's got the version string that I talked about. He's just caching the timer.html, the CSS, and the JavaScript of the page. Something else he's doing, if I went offline, he's using local storage. So I can come in here and view the developer tools in Chrome or WebKit. And you can see, again, I mentioned that you can see visually what's being stored in the browser locally to the application. So in local storage here, I can see the domain that's storing what's being stored. But if I was to turn off this application, it's going to cache the resources locally. But he's also using local storage to cache what the last timestamp of the clock running. So when I press refresh and I'm offline, it's going to continue on from where it was, which is pretty cool, right? It's a great user experience. So that's a quick introduction to app cache. A couple more advanced features that I'll sort of skim over since they were just talked about are web workers and WebSockets. Web workers in the fact that, right, we can finally take advantage of a user's full computer, right? We have multi-core CPUs. These machines are becoming faster and faster. It's really great that we can finally, in JavaScript, spawn multiple processes and do a lot of computational work inside of JavaScript without blocking UI. A couple of use cases, why would you want to use a web worker? Maybe you're syntax idling a bunch of text. We do this on our Google code pages all the time. Maybe you're processing large JSON responses from an API call. Image processing large arrays. These are just using the audio APIs that are coming out as part of HTML5. Maybe you're doing some analysis there. Another great example is WebSockets. So we can finally use real-time communication with inside of HTML5. So, use cases here, a chat room, a whiteboarding app, which I'll show you. Games is another great example. So the Quake 2 game that was ported from Java to JavaScript actually uses WebSockets for this real-time multiplayer communication. And just to show you, this is what we do sort of today in web apps, right? We make XHR requests, we keep pulling, and that's not a great model, right? That's just not, it's not a great user experience, it slows things down, we use a lot of bandwidth. Instead, let's open up this bidirectional communication, sort of as a TCP socket, if you will, in JavaScript. So this is an application, and feel free to log on to this right now. It's mrdoob.com/project/multi-user-pad. And this is a whiteboarding application. And basically what he's doing is, you see a few people drawing on here. I drew HTML5 on there before the presentation started, but he's using Canvas and WebSockets to create this multi-user experience. So he's got a chat in the corner, people can chat in real time. You can see the cursors moving, and it's really, really fast, actually. I was just sitting by my colleague over there, and I could see my mouse almost in real time moving on his screen, so it's pretty cool. So WebSockets, Canvas, I think that's all he's using, but just a great demo of sort of HTML5 technologies working together. Just to prove to you I can actually draw on this. I'm not a very good artist, though. So let's talk about real quick tools and compatibility, because the state of the web today, sort of, we're pushing all these HTML5 features and telling developers use them, but not all browsers are quite there yet. So the Google Fonts API, web fonts I talked about earlier in CSS, but this is something we launched at Google I/O this year, and it's really bringing a directory of beautiful open source web fonts to the web. So for instance, you have a site like this, right? This is a news site. Maybe this is HTML5.4, say. There's not a lot going on here. We're using H tags and paragraph tags to display the text. But we can really, using web fonts, really enhance this page a lot, making it look like an actual magazine or a newspaper. So you can see at the top there, I'm using a web font that looks like the New York Times font. We've used CSS to style the text using web fonts. There's column layouts. That's another thing in CSS. You can have multiple columns. No more JavaScript for that, which is really, really nice. What else is going on this page? So there's rounded corners, and there's just all kinds of CSS goodness on this page. And really, in few lines, we can transform a site into something beautiful. The API itself, really, really dead simple to use. Basically, what you do is just link to the style sheet that you want with the fonts that you want, so Tangerine here and this other one, and then just use it within the font family of your CSS properties. And then this is an example of what that would look like. So we put a text shadow on it using CSS and use the Web Fonts API to make that text really, really beautiful. The beauty of this is you can make sites like this, and the Chile government was actually one of the first sites that started to use the Fonts API. And all this is web fonts. So all these navigation bars here are using web fonts. The styling here is web fonts, and it's just using the API. But the really cool thing about this is if you're in Google Chrome, right, you'll notice that the translate bar comes down. Now, I don't speak great Spanish, but I definitely can't read it as well as I can speak it. But in Google Chrome, you can hit the translate button. And if the internet works for us, you can immediately see that all of the text on that page was transformed to English, because that's my native language. And so really, you can't do this in something like Flash, which is really, really powerful. So it's just using the couple APIs together in HTML5 to present a better user experience, not only for compatibility, but accessibility. So another big thing for compatibility is Google Chrome Frame. We'll talk a little bit about that. This is sort of the current breakdown, at least as of July, of the browser share. So we have about 60% of users using IE or IE 6, 7, and 8. And then so the more modern browsers are sort of lagging and staggering behind. So that's sort of the reality of things today. And as web developers, right, we have to do a lot of hacks on our site. We have to spend a ton of resources trying to work around these different browser incompatibilities. So this is an example of how I believe Chrome 5 renders the ACID3 CSS test, right? These tests test layout, animation, pseudo-selectors, things like that. And this is what IE, I believe 6 or 7 when I tested it, renders it. So 20 out of 100, not too good. And so as developers, right, we have to, again, do all these hacks. and spent all this development cost getting around these issues. This is what Google Wave does for IE6. There's too many just advanced features in Google Wave that they just said, hey, let's punt on this. We'll show them a pop-up, users using that browser, and give them the option to install Chrome Frame. And what Chrome Frame is a plugin. So think of when you have IE as the browser, right? There's the UI of IE and the page renders inside of IE. What Chrome Frame does is when the user installs it, it actually renders the page inside of Google Chrome itself. So you get the CSS and the layout and the speed of the V8 JavaScript engine and HTML layout. You get the security and sandbox of Google Chrome. But the user is still comfortable because they're using IE as sort of the UI. And so if a site works in Google Chrome, it's going to work in Google Chrome Frame. So that's really beautiful, right? You don't have to really target all these different browsers anymore. Another tool for compatibility is a tool that one of my colleagues put out, which is the MODERNIZR library. Instead of using navigator.userAgent for checking what browser the user is using, it's far, far better to use feature detection. So if you have a geolocation application, right, you should detect and see if that feature is available in JavaScript. If it's not, then fall back to a different solution. If video isn't available in HTML5, fall back to Flash. Same thing with audio and other solutions. So what this does, this library, basically when you include it on your page, just runs a suite of tests and just creates elements, checks a style, or sets a style and checks a style. And if that all checks out and comes back true, then you know that feature is available. And what it does is annotate the HTML tag with all the features available in the user's browser. So it's just a great tool. It's a minimal download for actually getting this stuff up and running. And then you can do things like in JavaScript, right? Check the MODERNIZR.audio to see if the audio tag is available. Pretty simple, true or false, a Boolean property. Another great site, caniuse.com. So if you've ever wondered what features available across browsers, just go to Can I use this feature? This is using, I think I typed in transitions for CSS transitions, and you can see across the board which browser versions exactly use and implement these features. So Safari, Chrome, and Opera doing really good. Firefox just added support in 4, and then Internet Explorer 9 is sort of nebulous at this point, but great resource. Also another resource that is a complete hour-long session. I only have 30 minutes, unfortunately, but the developer tools themselves are really, really fully functional. We saw a little bit of the storage capabilities, and you can query and see what the browser is doing. But also network traffic, things like timing, debugging JavaScript. You can actually edit a page and build your web application without ever having to press refresh. I promise you, I've done it. It's really, really cool. Another great site, and thank you, Michael, for referencing it. This is something our team put out. I'm actually one of the contributors to it, HTML5rocks.com. And it's just, we have tutorials, we have sample code, we have the playground where you can actually experiment with each of the APIs. And we just launched, I believe yesterday, as part of the site, is an HTML5 Studio. So the Studio is really about really cool, flashy samples, right? There's different APIs that highlight geolocation, video. We actually have, if you want to take the presentation that you saw today in the previous talk, we have a sort of a template that you can start using to implement some of this, and you can change certain properties. All right, and it's really cool because it's also reusable code. So this stuff is available on the web. It's all open source. Here's an example of using the file API. So for instance, I can use drag and drop, HTML5 drag and drop, to drag files from my desktop to the web browser. And we'll read those using the file API and apply some cool CSS transitions and float those up. But that's really great. So we can do things like, maybe we have an MP3 player. We could read MP3 metadata in our application, whereas we couldn't before. Let's show you another cool demo here. So this is using the video tag, and sorry, I apologize if you can't see it too well, but basically there's 2 videos here, right, and I can toggle in between them. And this is using video tag and canvas, and some custom controls in the video tag. So this isn't the default browser UI, but UI that we've come up with. And you can see sort of the effect, the shadow effect, the glow effect on either side of the video, which is pretty cool. And that's just using canvas. So using Canvas, you can read image data and set image data from the video tag itself. So you can read literally frame by frame and set that inside of the canvas. So it's analyzing the pixel data. One other quick demo here before I quit. Everybody likes showing video demos because they're really, really cool. Again, just a HTML5 video, right, playing using the native browser controls. But what's cool about this, again, is it's using Canvas. It's using, well, I guess we can see what it's using. HTML5 video, Canvas, CSS 2D transforms, and a mask feature. So if I apply the mask, you can see the CSS mask is being applied here. It's really cool. So again, it's reading frame by frame and applying each of those to Canvas and turning that into ASCII art, which is really, really neat. All in real time. So that's how powerful JavaScript is now. So I think that's all I had. My last slide is just a bunch of resources, sort of the sites I highlighted. If you do have, I highly recommend using the developer channels of all the browsers, because these are where the APIs sort of first, HTML5 APIs come out first. So experiment with them, use them, give us feedback, right? If you guys don't develop on them and use them in your apps, and we won't know there's bugs or feature requests that you really want implemented. So file bugs, crbug.com for Chrome and sort of WebKit bugs. If you want to follow us on Twitter, @ChromiumDev is sort of where we make our developer announcements related to Chrome. And then there's an HTML5 discussion group there at the bottom. And I'll post these online for you to get all these links. So thank you. That's it for me. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
好，那我非常谢谢 Eric 给我们带来精彩的演讲。好，那接下来时间就是中午的午餐时间哈，所以各位就可以凭各位的背举后面早上报到的时候拿到了这个餐盒，好，来领取免费的便当。好，那下午一样在这个场地有其他的这个 HTML5 的 session 好，如果你还有兴趣的话，那下午不要忘记了继续回到这边。好，谢谢大家。